So, good afternoon to everyone watching us in Brazil, and good evening to those of you watching us from Asia. My name is Guilherme Tudium, and I'm the president of the South American Institute for Politics and Strategy, ISAPI. And we are delighted to host today Dr. Aravind Yelery, who is joining us from India for the discussion of his new book, China Inc. Between State Capitalism and Economic Statecraft. Dr. Yelery is a senior fellow at the HSBC Business School at Peking University in China and holds a PhD in Chinese studies with a focus on political economy. We are also joined today by Eric Ribeiro, who holds a PhD in strategic and international studies. Dr. Ribeiro has been a visiting fellow at ITSA in India and is currently the head of our Asia program at ISAPI, and Bettina Salter, who holds a master's degree in strategic and international studies as well. I would like to highlight that this is a joint event hosted by ISAPI in a partnership with the Workshop on China and East Asia Studies at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, also known as UFRGS, of which Eric and Bettina are also coordinators. For those watching us from overseas and who are not familiar with both institutions, ISAPI is an independent and non-profit think tank focused on strategic studies and international relations, which is based out of Porto Alegre, the capital of the southernmost state in Brazil. And UFRGS is a leading educational institution in Brazil, which has been ranked as the best federal university in the country for 8 consecutive years between 2012 and 2019. It was precisely back in 2019, right, Aravind, before the pandemic, that we had the pleasure of hosting you at the university in a joint event between the Center for International Studies on Government at UFRGS and ISAPI, which is also available on YouTube as well. So I'm proud to say that Aravind is already a recurring partner of ours, and by all means is always welcome. So the structure of this panel will be the following. First, Professor Aravind will offer a presentation of his new publication, which will then be followed by comments and questions offered by Eric and Bettina. And then we will open the floor for questions from 2 of our researchers who are specialists on China and requested access to the publication. So without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Dr. Aravind Yelery.
Okay, great. So I think I must first thank ISAPI and UFRGS for hosting me, and thank you for being so kind about extending an invitation and agreeing to hold the program. Thanks, Guillermo. Thanks, Eric, Bettina, and Netting. I just maybe misspelled the name, but thank you so much. Well, I think the first important thing is I'll not take long, just 10 to 15 minutes of short introduction to the book and what prompted me to write the book and what the book covers all about. We have seen, we read more about China, we talk more about China quite often, and I think most of us are quite amused and oriented about the China's progress. Maybe for Brazilians or anyone, China is pretty far from them, and so there is always a kind of an interest in Chinese studies. So important instigator or important reason, I started taking up this project on China because of the 2 reasons, and the 2 reasons, as it's mentioned in the book, is of the 2 important aspects of looking at China. That's one is this economic statecraft and state capitalism. We are in the present term are seeing a lot of developments with related to China, and a lot of global affairs being influenced by the China affairs, or the affairs especially where the China influences the global economy, global strategy, or global exchange of ideas, and so on and so forth. So China has been at the epicenter. China has been at the center of a lot of dynamics in global affairs, and as a result of it, it becomes quite interesting to read China and to study China. Now, if there is so much to talk and so much to read about China, it was a challenge for me to focus on few variables and to write or to elaborate on those two matters. Because when we hear about China, we hear about the growth stories, we hear about how China has passed those learning curves, or maybe has left those learning curves for other countries to follow, and the lightning speed of its development. This year, China completes, one of its centenaries, the two centenaries. So the one of the centenary was to elevate the Chinese population out of poverty, and and complete 100 years of the establishment of the party. So there is no coincidence of the book coming in 2021, because I started working on the project about for 1.5 years, and it just happened that the production happened in 2021. So one aspect of China, knowing about how China has passed this learning curve, but the second part of the Chinese growth has been a lot about the environmental degradation, the shoddy finances, the role of deteriorating role of intellectual property rights, income disparities, and then we hear the case of Evergrande, one of the prominent largest property developer, being listed as a default, paying interest over its bonds. Evergrande was not only the case. We have the case of Alibaba. Jack Ma has been detained, has been put under close investigation. TT, one of the taxi services, has been put into investigations. A lot of private enterprises have been facing problems dealing with the Chinese state and Chinese government. Okay, then we have about a lot of internationalization schemes run by the Chinese banks, Chinese state, and Chinese enterprises under the name of Belt and Road Scheme. While we talk all these things, the two important variables which come forth is how differently the Chinese state capitalism then. It talks about growth, then it talks about the other darker side of the growth. Then it talks about the growth was only for the manufacturing, which was about 30% of its GDP, which has been got down to somewhere about 17% in the present context. China doesn't want to be a manufacturing hub now; it is going towards innovation, and all these transitions has been closely affected by the way the state capitalism has been run by the state or the leadership. So it was very important to look at some of these aspects. Now, when I say that I wanted to investigate about state capitalism, it was important from the point of research that I needed to find out some variable or some methodology, and then the basic methodology was here to look at the institutions, because the state capitalism has been manifested through the structures and the institutions within the Chinese economy. And when I say institutions, I decided I just focused or brought it down to the state enterprises, because the state enterprises are those enterprises which have been consecutively called as the core of the Chinese economy, or the elder brother of enterprises in the Chinese economy. So the state capitalism of China was different, because the way the state enterprises have been brought into the mainstream, and they are trying to give more sort of traction to the Chinese economy, were phenomenal. And as a result of that, I had to stick to a methodology where I wanted to focus on the enterprises to study the state capitalism, and then the dynamism in state capitalism. While I was doing all that, I understood that the state capitalism is not only assumed by the Peking itself, because if you look China, it's a quasi-federal country. The provinces play an important role. The leadership, after spending about 35 years in the cadre, in the political participation, in political socialization, they reach somewhere about NPC, and then Politburo, and things like that. So it was important again to understand the state capitalism at the center as well as the subnational level, and also understand how these enterprises at the center and subnational level interact or compete or cooperate. And that's the reason it became quite essential to study the small levers of the state capitalism through these enterprises, their interactions, and how they affect each other, how the competition is getting gruesome, or is getting very worst, very competitive, and at times most of these provinces and enterprises, subnational enterprises, come together, and try to adjust through push and pull factors. That's one part of the book. The another part of the book was about the economic statecraft. Again, looking at the role of the state enterprises. If you just take out the book of the Fortune Global 500 companies, China has a sizable footprint in the global Fortune 500 companies, starting from 90s in 21st century, in the last decade per se, ended with 2010, and in 2020 also. So China has matched the number with the American enterprises, and if you consider enterprises from Taiwan and Hong Kong, China has already overtaken the United States. Now looking at the Belt and Road Scheme and how this economic growth and the state capitalism has taken care of the strategic endeavor by the Chinese state to build an image of China has been quite significantly overlooked in a lot of literature. And I wanted to study that economic statecraft, since I had taken enterprises as one of the variable in my methodology to understand the intensity and to map out the state capitalism. I use the same variable to understand that how robust, how different is the economic statecraft of China than the other countries. And the second part of the book is all about the economic statecraft. Last couple of minutes, I think I would like to leave it to the discussant and those who have read the book. The book is not only about the chronological development, or it's just not the analysis. It takes a very critical look at the Chinese economy per se, because the Chinese state capitalism has not been spared by the competition between the leadership, between the provinces, as well as there are a lot of factors, a lot of stories and cases the book brings forward. We have cases of the provinces, we have the cases of the enterprises prominently, which have been used to substantiate the debate. So this is not just the analysis, this is not just a narration of a problem, but this is narrating a problem and validating the problem. And I think that's where that is what the brief USPs of the books are. And I think I want to stop there and want to hear the other opinion and inputs on the book by others. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aravind, for your insights, and congratulations on your book. Eric, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Guilherme. Thank you, Aravind, for being here with us in this evening for you there. And first, I would like to praise you for the effort, because it's a very dense book. And although it has about 350 pages, it seems that there's like 1,000 pages of content in there. And I think though you wrote it for someone who's not actually specialized, and for specialists as well, this was your aim. I think it goes to say, without saying, that it's a major effort in the field. And it takes a lot of effort sometimes, because it's a complex system of public enterprises in China. And from our experience in Brazil, for example, the system is so much different. And even from the Soviet Union too, you trace some parallels with Eastern European countries, post-Soviet countries, and the Russian experience. And it seems that the Chinese had a completely symbiotic relationship between the state enterprises and the state itself and the party. before Deng's reforms. So that was very interesting to read this journey. You deal into philosophy, into, of course, political economy is the main subtext of everything you're doing there. So how ideology, how institutions, how society viewed all of these changes, because it's very easy to talk about everything right now, like 40 years later. But at that point, China had a Maoist background, and it was very radicalized by all the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward. Everything was very tense at that point. And I think one of the points I would like to discuss today with you and with our audience and our colleagues here is that Deng Xiaoping did an amazing work, politically speaking, at mediating the political conflicts, the factions. We know that, broadly speaking, the Communist Party is divided between the Shanghai faction and the Shanghai Five, as some people say, and a more reformist and more like broad development stream of thinking, which was also, which Hu Jintao was part of, which is like the youth of the Communist Party. So Deng at that time was able to bring them all together under the same roof, under the same project, and that was the only thing that made the reforms possible and made everything change. And now we have Xi Jinping again in a time of crisis, where not even talking about the domestic crisis, like the whole world is in crisis, and forget about COVID, right? We had the Shanghai bubble, and we had recently the crackdown on tech firms in China also. So everything is kind of coming to a break point. We can see many factors contributing to change, and maybe to China. You wrote in your book also that China needs to find a way forward, right? Because it's facing many problems inside and abroad. So that's the first provocation for debate I would like to make about leadership. Which kind of leadership is Xi Jinping, and to which path he's steering China towards in the future? How do you see that question? And if Xi Jinping is... how can we trace this parallel between Deng's moment and how he was able to mediate, and Xi Jinping, which apparently was able to mediate some conflicts inside the party, but outside of the party, it's a very different approach. It's more of the winner takes all, and he wants to tighten his grip, especially against private businesses and tech businesses, which kind of bringing the country closer to a more financialized kind of economy, while the Communist Party wants to follow a more productive and innovation technology kind of economic model. Because if we look at the history of great powers, many have succumbed, let's say, to private interests and to financialization of economy. This happened with Britain. This happened with the United States, which faced a major deindustrialization since the 1960s, 70s. And China is also beginning to struggle with this imbalance in its economy also, because finance grows bigger, services grow bigger, and the productive sector, the manufacturing, the innovation and technology systems are not as attractive to investment as finance in many cases. So how do you see this economic imbalance inside, and also the role of the state-owned enterprises in the system? A few more observations I saw from the book. You wrote a chapter on the SOEs and the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is very interesting. I really enjoyed the case you brought forward. And that kept me thinking that, broadly speaking, the SOEs follow the path of the BRI. So it's very interesting how the government leads the Chinese investments abroad, and how this is different from the West, and how it's been working in many ways, but also that these companies were not really ready for this expansion. And in many cases, they have been less successful than their Western counterparts in private investments abroad and public investments as well. And in this sense, how can we access this? How can we evaluate the role of these companies in the BRI system? And if they're not successful in their enterprises, how can China sustain its competitiveness abroad and its influence? And I think that's one of the major topics of the book, right? How China has to balance the role of these companies in the domestic market, and how it's completely different of their role abroad, and sometimes they're conflicting too. So that's a big question, and also because they're facing a lot of criticism also. Internationally speaking, you brought an example of a Chinese company which was barred for a time. It suffered sanctions from the World Bank and also on other development banks because of its malpractices and corruption and litigation. So how this interplays with the context of strategic competition between great powers, and how Chinese companies might also be affected by this process. We of course we know that there are malpractices, but also there's a big political movement in many developed countries against China, and this is also hurting their businesses. And I would like to know also how do you see that question, if this could worsen in the future and shut more doors for Chinese companies abroad. I have a few more questions too, but I think for now that's it, and I think we can move forward, and later I can give a few more insights about my readings. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Aravind, please feel free to answer Eric's remarks.
Okay, great.
And then we go on to Bettina.
Well, I think thank you, Eric, for those insights. I think I want to just club them together and answer. Especially the last question was very provocating about, if the Chinese enterprises know they're not performing, what led to their outward movements? Well, the Chinese companies' outward movements has started very late. In 2013, and Belt and Road was just an excuse. Before that, also the Chinese companies were looking to diversify and look for new geographies, and that it happened so because the China's quest for minerals, China's quest for the natural resources. But what you see after the Belt and Road launch, the non-natural resource, non-mineral sectors started getting more attention by the Chinese enterprises and bidding. So the mergers and acquisitions by the Chinese companies were raised at a frightening scale from 2013, and they were into everything. They were into media, they were into buying Hollywood studios, they were buying into the online platforms and everything, despite knowing that most of these businesses were running low as far as the revenues were concerned, and the Americans were looking for the easy buyouts, and the Chinese offered them the hand. So anyway, these were not turning the profitable. Well, and there is a theory in economics basically that the diversification of the production units can be profitable to a certain extent, because in those domestic economies, the cost of labor would go up, the cost of natural resources would go up, and then the leverage you have over the net profits would go down, and then there is a break even, and then you cannot really keep on counting on your production diversification. Diversification of your production units. So The war-scale diversification, war-scale mergers and acquisition by the Chinese enterprises were untimely and unwise. And that's the reason you would see that from 2017 onwards, the regulators came up with number of guidelines telling enterprises reducing the amount of the capital which was used to acquire these companies, which were turning completely hopeless for the Chinese economy. So I think there was nothing coming back to China. You have seen the cases where the port, the port in Sri Lanka, which the Chinese developed, it really went bankrupt. They were not earning any profits. So now the Chinese have taken over the project entirely. So there are a lot of such cases, and then the Chinese have only one interest, not the profit, not the expansion, not the diversification, but a strategic interest to use those bases, those industries, to create a kind of a diplomatic push, a strategic push wherever it was required. And that's an answer for the last question. The question with regard to what kind of leadership Xi Jinping is trying to portray or put forward, and maybe despite these economic balances, what is coming next in Chinese leadership. Well, if you see, though China claims that it has a unified political thinking and political orientation, it is not so. Because if that was the case, Deng Xiaoping would have never had taken a path which was desisted by the old school, right? So Deng Xiaoping has his own compulsions. Going forward, when Deng Xiaoping left power, or maybe the new president came in power, Jiang Zemin had a different pressure, to deal with, and Hu Jintao had a different pressure to deal with it. Xi Jinping has a different pressure to deal with it. What has happened essentially is that all this leadership had different style. If you see, Deng Xiaoping, after Jiang Zemin came in, Jiang Zemin's style of running the government was very different than somebody like Hu Jintao, who was a well-behaved boy, well-mannered boy. And then Xi Jinping again is a well-behaved, well-mannered boy, but again, he looks like a backbencher, he's a bit bullish. So every leadership has their own characteristics to influence the Chinese economy. So most of us make fundamental mistake by putting all this leadership into a single basket, which is not the case. And having said that, this is somewhere corroborated with what Xi Jinping is doing. Remember, Xi Jinping, he has a background serving in Zhejiang, serving in Fujian, and the coastal regions, Fujian facing Taiwan, okay, and Zhejiang, where Jack Ma has, headquarters in Hangzhou, one of the top provinces as far as privatization is concerned. Xi Jinping has a revolutionary background as well. He went and served in villages during the Cultural Revolution, and then you would see the kind of mindset he has developed is very different than the others. Okay, and these are the people, these are the leadership which has seen the worst. Okay, now I say that Fujian and Zhejiang, and when in 2007, when he was taken into the Politburo, 2007 was also the year when the Chinese economic growth hit the top figure, two-digit figure, about 14%. 2007 and 8 was also a watershed period when the global financial crisis was slowly coming and becoming a reality. That was a very hard time for Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping taking control, coming into the inner circle of the party with this experience, made up his mind. And that's the reason actually why I say the Chinese leadership or Chinese state under Xi Jinping is different than the earlier leadership. I mean, maybe this would be different again 10 years down the line when there is a new leadership coming in, because I see that the leadership or the state under China, under Xi Jinping, is more resilient, more rebellious, more authoritative. And I would say that the Xi Jinping has reinvented the state capitalism. How it has reinvented? I spoke about the unsustainable formula of debt the Chinese developed over the period of 40 years. Okay, subsidies. You have a cronyism. You have intellectual property theft. He knew all these things. He knew what happened in 2007 and 8. He knew how the growth is, becoming sluggish, and he came up with the policies, which were outstanding. He wanted to make economy more stronger. He wanted to use more repressive powers. He wanted to use more, exercise more authority power to put all these things together. In China, when there is a crisis, the state comes to power. But unlike in other liberal states, when there is a more liberal, elements are introduced, in China, that is not the case always. In times of crisis, the state is looked as the last messiah. The state comes into the picture. It infuses capital, but also it exerts a lot of control, and that's the difference. And I'll give you one more. I'll give you an example to this thing. From 2013 onwards, a lot of things have happened. The trade war happened, right? The pandemic has happened, but the growth in 2019 and 19 and 2020, at the height of the pandemic, you would say that the Chinese economy has performed well. And as per the IMF forecast, the growth of China in 2020, even if it was 1%, it was equivalent to 8% to America. The top stock exchange, the top performer at the level of stock exchange globally in 2020 was Shenzhen. Shenzhen bet New York Stock Exchange. This is something new. And going back to the imbalances and the new drivers of the Chinese economy, Xi Jinping is very well aware of that. So the new agenda, new economic agenda, which Xi Jinping, the new leadership, is trying to force, is trying to push, is based on two legs. One is to make market and innovation work better, to work together. So the earliest, the trade, the market, the state were not essentially taking care of innovation here, right? So now you have the mix of autocracy, technology, and dynamism. This is new economy. This is a new economy which is sometimes called as Shinomics, which is different. Why suddenly in last 10 years, and in last 10 years, that means 8 years we're talking about Xi Jinping, the ratio or the share of trade in China GDP has gone down by 12%, from 30 to 17%. Why this happened? Because I think China does not give more importance to trade anymore. It wants to look at innovation. It wants to improve the economic legal systems. It wants to improve the debt records which it has. So a lot of these things have been introduced by Xi Jinping, and I think he's just about starting. There are what 15 years, 10 to 15 years, because these efforts needs to be consolidated somewhere. That's the reason the Chinese state capitalism, which is today, is different, but 10 years back under Hu Jintao, and again different from 20 years back, which was Chiang Zemin, under Chiang Zemin. So this is what China looks like in today's context.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Aravind. Bettina, the floor is yours.
So first, I'd like to thank Aravind for being here with us today, helping to spread studies about Asia in Brazil from a Southern perspective, and congratulate him for his book. Looking at the book China In, Aravind gave us a very comprehensive account of the state-owned enterprises functioning in China. He has taken up in his book many issues of China economic model that help us to understand China's state capitalism. China economic reforms and the SOEs are looked in a larger context. It considers strategic management, competitive capitalism, and global economy perspective. So it was very interesting to me to come across a variety of political instruments, strategic objectives, institutional reforms, networks that had been involving the Chinese state in different degrees. The Chinese state capitalism, as Aravind put in his book, walk away from welfarism and liberal values, right? So China does not want to stop short of creating an economy or political setup with Chinese characteristics alone, but it is also developing a system that is alternative to the Western system. I would like to ask you, Aravind, how do you see China's neighbors and also the world reacting to it? And if you already see other countries adopting this development model. As you point out in your book, the straightening of the SOEs was also seen a step closer towards economic statecraft, which means China is developing its wealth for strategic foreign policy purposes, right? This is a very interesting, important point. Economy and politics go together inside and outside the country. In the recent years, the SOEs have been helping China to build a force overseas, and the Belt and Road Initiative has an important part on it. The chapter about the Belt and Road is very interesting, and Eric already pointed that out. But I would like to ask you if you could talk a little bit more for the ones that are watching us now. About the relationship about the COEs and the Belt and Road. This is a subject that we have very interesting. This is a very interesting subject, and here in Brazil we have a special interest in this topic. China state capitalism also is balancing between a social modernization drive in a purpose and a pursuance for great power status. In your book, we observe that the states deploy state enterprises and other agencies to deliver this job, right? So what happens if this state enterprise don't perform, in the sense of what are the implications for the world in terms of politics and the global trading system in the changing nature of the state capitalism in China? And for further studies, I think it is very interesting to consider where the SOEs fit in that technological revolution, which are related to the changes of power international system, and also what are the involving role of private enterprises in the Chinese economy. These are 2 points that I think are interesting to be discussed further. So that's it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bettina.
Okay, thank you, Bettina. I mean, I'll just take a lot of questions. I'll try to answer them briefly. Very insightful interventions you have made. I start with the last point. You said, what role the private enterprises are playing. Private enterprises have been, working as an auxiliary wheel for the Chinese state. While the large enterprises and public enterprises were engaged in the act of, providing public goods and welfare, social security, and the private enterprises did not have any such role to play. They did not need to, shoulder providing the social security, and as a result of it, if you'd say that, the township village enterprises, and then the privatizations which kicked off in late 80s and which thrived throughout 90s and 2000, helped a lot to the Chinese economy to gain substantial experience dealing with the new frontiers of economy, whether that is e-com. E-com was done solely by the private enterprises. Technological interventions, the IPRs are owned by the private enterprises. So private enterprises play a very important role in the Chinese state-led economy. Unfortunately, as the book discusses, the role of the private enterprises have been sidelined over the period of time and again by the Chinese state, and at the cost of the interest, which is in favor of the state or the public institutions. So what we see in today's China is that the private enterprises are struggling to maintain their own standing. There is hardly anything with the Chinese private enterprises cannot say no to, because there are party members on the board. The party has stipulated certain terms to be included in the memorandum of associations, the way the organization enterprises would run, and that is being told by the constitution. So you do not have any way to run around. You do not have any attorney to help you and say that, okay, well, this is a way you can circumvent it. So private enterprises are in a very difficult position right now in China. Despite the fact that AI, automation, machine learning is picking up, and innovation is the flag bearer and something new the Chinese economy should talk about or force more importance on. But oppositely, this is not happening. Okay, that was an answer to the private enterprises. Now, how the neighboring countries are taking the Chinese growth? Well, I mean, everyone around China is taking Chinese growth with a pinch of salt, and everyone has their own interpretations of looking at Chinese growth. If you talk about India, because India has been in one of the top 10 economies globally, we number 10. And we have population or demographic composition equal to China or better than China because of the working population which we have. And then slowly India is trying to slip into the position of manufacturing in the global supply networks and global production networks. So yes, the question is very valid over here, but India is not trying to emulate anything from China. What India is trying to do is we are trying to avoid mistakes that China has made. And if India keeps aside and learns something from Chinese mistakes, that is the biggest learning curve for India or Indian economy. And I think that is what the neighboring countries, India, one of the neighboring countries, is doing it. Apart from that, the state capitalism, the way it has functioned, the way it has evolved, has also affected a kind of a balance between the China's trade relationship with its partners, mainly with the APEC countries or the Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN countries. And there is a lot of reshuffling and a lot of diversification as far as the trade is concerned between China and China's trading partners. You can see the distant neighbors like West Asia has been coming out with a different formula to work with China. So yes, there are invariable asymmetric responses to Chinese state capitalism globally. So this is immediate neighbors and neighborhood at distance. With regard to your question about SOS and BRI, again, if I can link my answer to my first question, or my first answer to your question was about the private enterprises. Well, if BRI had something credible to operationalize something, the private enterprises were at good place. But if you look at the percentage of the state-owned enterprises in the Fortune 500 companies, and then the huge network of the state-owned enterprises across the globe, you would notice that the state-owned enterprises are the leading drivers of BRI, because BRI is a state-sponsored, is a state-led uh, program, and then the state enterprises have no way to say no, or say that we do not want to subscribe to it. So the banks, including the financial institutions, transportations, and including the manufacturing enterprises, everyone is bandwagoning, and everyone is trying to be part of the BRI. With regard to distant neighbors, countries like Brazil, you see, how influential is State Grid in Brazil. Oh my God! I mean, State Grid has been prominently present in Brazil. The largest investment by the State Grid overseas is in Brazil. And not only in power generation, electricity supply and distribution, or smart grid projects, but there is everything which is coming. They are there, into automobile. They are into the natural resources. So the state enterprises will remain a part of BRI. Rather, Bettina, what I think is that in my chapter, I put BRI as one of my chapters in the end. But the state capitalism looks beyond BRI. BRI is only one scheme. The state capitalism of China is going to survive longer than any schemes China is launching today or has launched yesterday. So the state capitalism, because if China is saying we have to develop the Chinese economy this way in 2035 or 2049, they are talking not only BRI, they're talking much larger game, much larger master plan. And the state-owned enterprises are not going to go anywhere. They're going to be here. Enough of consolidation has been done as far as the state-owned enterprises are concerned, starting from 1993, 1997, 2000, 2013, 15, and onwards. So enough has been done. Now, what is you see in the present 96, 97, the centrally owned state enterprises is they're extremely well maintained. A lot of excess, the burden has been taken away from them. They're consolidating. There is a lot of taking over, mergers are happening. These state-owned enterprises are taking over private enterprises. So these 96, 97 state-owned enterprises are going to remain there forever, which is not going to end. This is key for the Chinese state to control the country and the economy. Now, your question about what happens if SOEs do not perform. I mean, if I understand correctly, you mean SOEs do not perform domestically or internationally, or you just mean overall?
I mean, overall, because
Okay,
it
fine.
has an important role domestically and
Certainly,
growing
yeah.
internationally also.
Yes. So SOEs were not performing as per the expectations. When the Chinese economy was opened in 1978, the foreign investment started coming in, and Chinese state and leaders were happy getting in, attracting the foreign investments. But where is the capacity domestically? Realization of lack of domestic capacity, and then to deal with the foreign trade and foreign products, state-owned enterprises had to perform, and they were not performing. And since they were not performing, they were taken by the rule of stick, by the rule of merits, and they were asked to shut down their shops. They were asked to change the boards. They were asked to change the way they manage the companies. But the Chinese enterprises have come a long way after its initial reorientations, changes, restructuring, re-engineering the model of the way they used to work from 1990s to 2021. And I think Chinese enterprises have learned enough hard lessons. There is hardly any scope. Well, I mean, in my book, I say um, the state-owned enterprises know very well, the managers know very well, they are in the ring of words. They have to perform. If they don't perform, definitely the state-owned enterprises would not be shut down, but those who are at the control will be thrown out. They will not have soft corner or kind of a privilege to exist politically. If you do not have a privilege to exist politically in China, that means that you are you are not existing anywhere. So that's a big major risk on the head of the managers to make SOEs perform. SOEs have to perform. And that's the reason. Again, why some of the SOEs? Because SOEs are not in the manufacturing; they're in the banks also. Why Evergrande happened? Why the Evergrande was not stopped 20 years back, 15 years back? Why yesterday Fantasia happened? Why Baoshan Bank happened? Why these debts are happening? These debts are happening because most of these SOEs, like banking SOEs, would have the manufacturing SOEs. The manufacturing SOEs would have the administrative SOEs. So there's a nexus within this thing. And then really, when the red tapeism is being trimmed by Xi Jinping is targeting the way SOEs perform. So there is no room left. There is no way the SOEs can circumvent and say that, okay, fine, we are performing, but there are real metrics being deployed now on the ground where the performance has been measured. So yes, there is no way that you cannot perform. You have to perform. You have to perform. That's it. That's a golden rule. I mean, in SOEs in other parts of the world, I don't want to talk more about Brazil, but in India, yes, they have this binging. They just binge on the public properties and public funds and public finance and say that, well, I have another 2 years. Oh, let's see what happens. But in China, paradoxically, this is not the case. No more binging on the state public finance capacity or the properties and finance is acceptable anywhere. Your question on technological SOEs, that was with regard to how they're performing, or I just missed it because the list of question was a little longer. What you wanted to ask, Bettina, specifically?
Aravind, feel free to answer the questions that you want.
Well, okay. So I want to
all the questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
The thing about technological revolution is that it is related to the changes of our international relations, right? So how do SOEs fit into it?
SOEs are not performing up to expectations as far as the technology is concerned. All the technological changes, innovations were done by the private enterprises. And if you see that in recent times, the state enterprises were taking a refuge behind the success rate of the private enterprises. What is happening in China is most of the labs which are run by the public universities or public research labs have been funded by the states. And then the private research scheme of things or R&D has to take some kind of sponsorship or funds from the state. So the line which divides the public funds into research and private funds into research is very it's not there, which you can which will help you to make out a difference between how SOEs are performing well in technological fields. So my answer to your question is that as far as technology is concerned, state enterprises are far behind as far as the learning curve is concerned. They need another, at least about, if I can numerically put it, because once you put it numerically, it sounds interesting, right? At least about one cycle of the leadership, that is 10 years of leadership, and that's what Xi Jinping is trying to do. Most of the bottleneck technologies Chinese do not control. if you take smartphone technologies, you take technologies as far as the core technology of solar energy is concerned, the core technologies for the emission is concerned, the core technologies for satellite is concerned. All these things the Chinese have not been able to develop. Chinese have developed the plane, but it has not able to develop the jet engines. So what is the use of the plane, right? And the SOEs have been, been given very hard line sentences and directives by the state council and the leadership to do something about this innovation. But unfortunately, the innovation is not something, a computer program you just happen to sit together with Eric and you and develop it in one hour. No matter how much money you have, how deep pockets you have, that is not something. Rather, there is interesting study with regard to this thing. I think I would not go into this thing, but a lot of the innovation practices, a lot of the path-breaking innovation has been done in liberal ecosystems. I think I would like to stop there. If I go more than that, I think it looks like I'm this will be like anti-China, bashing China kind of thing. So I'll just leave it to you. You have any other questions, please, you can add it to that later on.
Perfect, Aravind, thank you. So Eric and Bettina, are you satisfied with the answers? I know Eric wants to follow up on a thing or two.
Yeah, sure. If I'm not stepping into your role, Guilherme, I would like to propose that we make like a big round of questions and we can take from the public and everything. So I have a short question, Aravind. Of course, we can discuss that later in private talks, but I think it's a major theme in your book too, and we haven't discussed that part yet, which is about economic philosophy and social philosophy, because Deng Xiaoping has changed that too. And China has changed with it. And now 40 years later, we have a different society. So whereas wealth and profit were seen as something quite negative before time, after that, it was a means to success, much like Calvinism in the West too. So the whole meaning of profit and wealth and having a higher standard of living gather a different meaning in China. And in that example, in the epilogue, when I was reading it, I was feeling like, well, China has its own factionalism, political, which spills over into the economy and the enterprises that are more favored by the state and less favored by the state. And in that kind of system, which is also deemed, I know much criticism comes from Indian scholars, especially because there's a lot of comparison. And many experts talked to me and they said, well, China is not a flexible model and it's very rigid politically. So if you put all of these things together and if you look at what is China trying to build, a meritocracy, a meritocratic system, a Mandarin system, as in their own languages, like the rule of the best, the most well equipped to move the country forward. If you take these two things together, do you think they bode well if you have all of this competition inside the state? And between public and private companies, and in this ecosystem, do you think there is room for some kind of ideal meritocracy as they're trying to put forward?
Very complex question, but I think let me answer it bit by bit. The economic philosophy of China has been, when it was founded, was very distributive. And I think that distributive philosophy behind the founding of the party and founding of the state was challenged later on. I think it was challenged in the first few decades under Mao also. But under Deng Xiaoping, this distributive philosophy of economic development was brought into the mainframe. And it was seen that China should open up. China should let the private and foreign enterprises come and play an important role to infuse wealth. The wealth creation which happened later on in 80s and 90s was of a different nature because there was no more distributive principles behind the growth and behind the development. Because in 1990s onwards, you would see that there was a quest. There was a quest to get rich, and people were getting rich. And to get rich and to become rich turned out to be a new class. So this class system which emerged in China was very different than the class system which existed, which the party fought for in 1949. Was again different, but China was again slipping slowly into the new class structure, and this class structure was very dangerous because this class structure was trying to create more challenges for party within the state, and this was going to question because this new class structure again decided the philosophy of political socialization. So normal cadre who did not have money would not have an access to prominent positions and prominent places of influence because he does not have enough money or enough wealth at his disposal, right? I mean, you would see that most of the leadership which are coming from the coast and who have performed well and maybe who have an access to NPC are being given more weightages. So the economic philosophy had changed, as you said correctly, and that had changed fundamentally in the modern China. In today's context, that has created more imbalances in the Chinese society because if you see the social well-being or the social distribution of wealth, that these are the two themes which Xi Jinping talks about under the rejuvenation of China, Chinese rejuvenation scheme of things. Xi Jinping talks about those are very far from the original ideas, original concepts. So what is happening is that the Chinese society, which has developed this, false concept of being economically affluent, is good and is okay, has been challenged by Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping says that that is not good. So Xi Jinping is targeting the super net worth individuals in China who have developed enterprises, who are accumulating wealth, and who are trying to control the wealth, amassing the wealth. So that has been a new challenge the leadership are trying to address. And by doing it, China has developed into a new kind of a philosophy where they want to indicate that the system is without any mistakes, right? Well, before the second point, again, just let me take one reference over here. David Schomburg wrote a book on China, and he made these empirical studies, and he came up with an indices and says that out of 13 to 14 developed countries who have been able to manage the middle income gap, 11 were the autocratic. I mean, his definition of being authoritative and autocratic is different. But this is somewhere stuck to Chinese, and Chinese thought that being not democratic, it's fine. We can still be a developed country. So the basic philosophy of running the state or running the state economy, state-led economy, without looking after the welfare, without looking after the democratic values, was okay in China, and that was taken as new normal for the Chinese leadership. Where the China is heading? Well, China is heading into a transition stage where China knows that growing slower is fine. Growing without any galactic expectations is fine. That is a new change that China is moving forward. Then secondly, most of these evils which China has accumulated over the period of last 40 years of economic development and 70 years of its foundation has been seriously dealt with now. The Chinese leadership wants to make sure that, because most of the social evils, corruption, deaths, income distribution have been taken out very seriously by the present leadership. So the Chinese want to make sure that they want to rejuvenate a new country. Last time I spoke, I gave a lecture about why China is not a great power, a great nation. China wants to become a great nation. A superpower, anyway, that's just a passing by stage. But China wants to become a great power again under Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping wants to play a critical role in accomplishing these goals. Well, I would say that the road to become a great power is very difficult. Maybe internally, domestically, China can claim so. China can say that fine, we are accomplishing it. But how that status of great power and great nation is assumed by its neighbors, by its watchers, is very essential to study. I don't know if I missed any questions from you, Eric.
Eric, do you want to follow up, or Bettina?
No, that's it. I think we have more questions from the audience too, so
okay,
I'm good.
Okay. Bettina, are you satisfied as well?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. And so now we'll move on to two questions from two of our researchers who are China specialists and have been granted access to review copies of the book. And for that, we kindly thank Professor Aravind for providing us with these copies. And the first one is from Professor Gustavo Federsen. Professor Federsen has also a doctorate degree in Strategic International Studies at UFRGS. He's currently an university professor at Universidade La Salle. He was awarded a Taiwan Fellowship in 2018, and he's now back in Brazil. So, and he asks, thank you, Professor Aravind. It is a unique opportunity for me to hear and read your excellent research. Congratulations on your book. My question is, do you believe the internationalization of the renminbi will change China's relations with its SOEs? If so, how? And what role does SOEs will play on this effort, and how their competitivity will be impacted during and after this process?
Well, the internationalization of renminbi is one of the important schemes that China wanted to do it under the economic statecraft, because being the largest trading partner to most of the continents around the world, and being a trading partner to immediate neighbors and distant neighbors, was not making any difference to China. What was the most important thing beyond going the trade was, it wanted to achieve a standard equivalent to USD, to challenge the position of the established international currencies, including Euro, USD, and the British Pound and the Yen. Because by having equal standing vis-a-vis the global currencies, it would have validated the China's rise. Okay, it somewhere reinforces the belief that the Chinese economic rise is just not an accident. The whole philosophy behind internationalization of RMB is this. As a result of it, when China was trying to push hard in 2016 and let RMB included into the IMF basket, SDR basket, the whole strategy was that to make RMB equivalent to USD. But you know what happened? This wouldn't have been possible because the criteria laid down by the IMF were much stricter as far as the international is concerned. For that matter, any internationalization of any currencies, you have to have RMBs holding into the foreign banks, in international banks, were one of the requisites. And trade became quite important factor in these things, because if SOEs are trying to bolster, it's going to try to inflate its activities through trade and through investments in its neighboring countries. That means that the RMB's flow or RMB's circulation will increase. The more the circulation of RMB, that means the countries which is dealing in trading with China would hold the RMB in their banks, in the local banks. That means that the China would qualify coming closer to make RMB an international currencies. And SOEs played a quite important role, as what I was saying in my earlier part of my discussion and lecture, that the whole effort of SOEs was not only to fulfill the requirement for natural resources, energy, or minerals. Was not that so. There was a strategic ambition behind this thing, and the strategic ambition was that the SOEs would lay down the ground or route through which the Chinese state would accomplish this status, that it is not just an economic power, it is a credible economic superpower. It is going to influence the global trade, not just by the trade figures, by the import export, but through currencies as well. And this effort somewhere was designed to dislodge or to make most of its trading partners decouple their currencies from the USDs. And I think this was one of the best schemes the Chinese could have ever thought of. How they would replace USD, giving important leviation to RMB at international level and institutional level. And this was the best way to do with it, right? Maybe I think Professor Feddersen, I'm not sure if I have answered the question to your satisfaction, but this is what I understand.
Thank you, Professor Aravind, and thank you, Professor Feddersen. We'll move on to Renato Ungaretti's question. Renato is a master's student in Strategic and International Studies here at UFRGS as well. He's a research fellow at ISAPI, and he's also a researcher at the Institute of Applied Economic Research, IPEA, which is a Brazilian government-led research organization dedicated to generation of macroeconomic, sectorial, and thematic studies in order to base government planning and policy making. And he asks, Professor Aravind, congratulations for your book and your great lecture. We are witnessing a pushback in Chinese investments and finance from policy banks since 2017, reflecting a wide range of factors. What are your perspectives for BRI? Is it possible to expect a return to the peak of investments seen in 2016, or the trend is towards fewer investments and loans in smaller, more sustainable projects?
Thank you, Renato. That was a good question. And I think the future trend would be smaller investments. The investments flow would be slowed down because there are more wise decisions being made by the State Council. The new guidelines which came after 2017 onwards. 2017 was the first when the first BRI forum was held. Subsequently, and later in 2018, there was second forum was held. A lot of things happened from the day the BRI program were proposed in 2013 until 2015. There was, I would say that there was complete anarchy among the Chinese think tanks, among the policymakers. Nobody knew about what this BRI is all about, right? And I think this was not Brazil, where I would put up an article and ask Mr. Bolsonaro, please explain what is BRI, or Mr. Modi, what is BRI is all about, right? So it was impossible. It was impossible to question. It was impossible to gauge the fathom, to gauge the depth, to gauge the scale and the width of the BRI scheme. So nobody knew actually how the BRI is all about, how this new elephant in the room looks like even, the optics were unclear completely. And while these all things were happening, there was a lot of jingoism in Chinese media, in Chinese economic sector, that, they have to do something if the, top leader says something, the supreme leader says something. And 14, 15, 16, 17 onwards, a lot of investments were made, which were, as I said, which were unwise. The term the Chinese themselves use when they audit most of the investment programs done by the enterprises and the banks overseas. So these unwise investment programs, unwise investment plans were stopped or were told not to do so, because this is not going to help the state anyway. Most of these investments, even the Chinese call, were foolish enough. So from 2017 onwards, 18 onwards, a new perspective developed within BRI schemes was about re-examining the investment scheme, re-examining the priorities, and re-examining the financial burdens and financial debt it would cause back in China. Well, one more thing over here, when the BRI schemes were proliferating at an electric scale, there was a new firm, a new enterprises was established. This was called Sinosure. The Sinosure was all about taking care of insurances for those enterprises which were going and investing along the path of BRI. And you would be surprised, the claims of bankruptcies and the claims of loss, the cases which came to Sinosure just kept increasing by 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x every year. That means that the enterprises were not performing. Their calculations to investment to profit were not wise enough. And then Sinosure, was busy more and more, even on the weekends, to calculate and how much money to give back to the Chinese enterprises. And interestingly, and from 2017 onwards, when these all audits started happening, new regulations started coming in place. That's the reason, those enterprises which were oiling the BRI, especially the financial investments companies or financial banks or the Silk Road funds, started retracting, started looking back into the scheme of things. They were taken over by magic words. So I think, yes, you would see that the next trend would be investments will slow down. Definitely, there are no doubts about it. Those are going to slow down. And if you look at the structure, and this is in my book, I don't know, but in one of my question and answers in another program, somebody pointed out it is on somebody on page number 274 or something. I don't know exactly. I don't have the book is lying next to me, but I don't want to do it. Where I have just pointed out that the Chinese economy is closing. This is the economy which said that we're opening. 3 years back, Xi Jinping, everywhere he went, to St. Petersburg, Davos, Tianjin, Boa, he says that we're opening. But interestingly, the indices, the empirical evaluation says that the China is becoming more closed economy. If China is becoming more closed economy, that means that it wants to conserve energy, it wants to conserve capital, it wants to conserve resources. I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing for Brazil, but that's the trend which is happening right now. And the financial investments and the loans would be smaller. They will be targeted. They will be particular, and they will not be open or free for everyone.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Renato, for your question. We'll now move on to some more questions from our audience. Firstly, Rafael Franceschi, who is a member of the workshop on China and East Asian Studies, and also a junior fellow at ISAP. He says, China's economic and political system and decisions have made the country the second major power. Did it happen because the system works well, or it was only because of favorable international scenario back there? Is China ready to truly face and win international competition worldwide? Thank you very much for the presentation.
Well, when China was opened, certainly the global trend was they were looking for a destination where they would get cheap labor, cheap resources, and a commitment, political commitment. The state capitalism in China is not just by accident. And I want to be very critical over here. I do not want to give all the 10 points to the leadership, 10 points to Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, or Chiang Samin. They don't deserve all the 10 points. Why state capitalism in China brewed at a faster rate? Just because of the international conditions. The international investment scenario were such that they thought if China is stable politically, they can bet upon it, right? If China is stable politically, that means that the economic development is assured, the trajectory is assured. That means we can invest in this country. As a result of it, the state capitalism, which is more authoritative, which is more quasi-liberal in China, was not the invention of the state itself. It was also an idea was given to Chinese by the foreigners or the foreign investors. There was a time when the foreign investors were very happy with the mode and the trend in the state capitalism. And I think the same foreign investors are unhappy today. And this is a paradox. This is another level of philosophical discussion we can engage later on. But Evergrande we talk about, and if you see the overseas investments, they did not know that it is the CPC. They did not know that it is the Xi Jinping who is in the power. They did not know that how authoritative system it is. And once the Evergrande collapse and it defaults on the interest over the bonds, and they're saying that it is a party, it is the communist. Well, I mean, you knew this thing. You knew how the system functions, right? So the whole question about what made China success, I would not give a credit to only the Chinese leadership, but the credit also goes to the international scenario. There was no taker in the 1980s. There was no taker for manufacturing. In today also, if you're going to ask, okay, we are going to come to your country with so much of pollution, so much of emission, would you allow us? No, definitely not. That's the reason why India lost a lot of the business during the trade war happened between US and China. It went a lot of the businesses went to Vietnam, a small country. So the success of China as a manufacturing hub is not something which they invented in the lab. It was not just the accidental. It was, a win-win situation for the global interests and as well as the Chinese interest. Well, now going beyond this thing, how much the Chinese have the competency if it is a liberal market forces to compete or out-compete? I think market has a very brutal algorithm. Market doesn't have a philosophy. Market doesn't have any principles. There are push and pull factors. You have a price, you have a demand, you need the consumers. And I think the whole level of competency depends upon if you have a demand for your supplies and if you have a capacity to supply, and I think if the consumer have interest in your supplies. And if you see today, despite the trade war, the Chinese companies have still good control over the large supply chains or control over the large supplies and consumables. Well, that's not only in Europe, that is not only in Asian neighborhood, but also reality in farthest neighborhood like LSE or in Africa, right? So competency is a very subjective matter. Competency in the technical terms is the demand and supply, and Chinese are well capable of meeting those needs. Remember one thing, when we say that Chinese are climbing up in the value chain, and some of you may be very energetic and say that, does that mean that it is really exiting the space for the manufacturing, which is not the fact. Chinese are not ready. Chinese not really happy to give that manufacturing space to even the smallest country. Forget about a country like India. So there is a lot of struggle in the space of manufacturing and productions, which one should really fight for. And so Chinese have competencies to maintain that. If you talk competency with regard to technology, with regard to value adds, yes, I think I can understand a kind of a hunch you have in your mind. uh, the Chinese have to go a long way, as far as the quality is concerned, as far as the brand is concerned, because brand is a culture. Okay, brand is culture, and that comes with a generation of experience. Specialty has gone into building value for a brand, and Chinese brands are very new in the market. They are very new in the market. If you want to compare, I like analogies always, and I always use analogies in my conversations. So Chinese brands are in their early teenagers, so they have to cross this teenage and turn into somewhere 30s, mid 35, to be calm, peaceful, confident, to go and bet for the market overseas. That's how I want to answer that.
Excellent. Thank you, Aravind. We have time for one last question, and
Okay.
this one is from Mauricio Levian. He's also pursuing his master's in Strategic International Studies at UFRGS. He says, Professor Yelery, congratulations for your book and your great presentation. Do you believe that BRI initiative can be an additional perspective to contribute to the expansion of China's economic statecraft model to different countries, instigating a sort of Chinese globalization model, with a special focus on the developing world, where strategies and policies such as the use of state-owned companies and investment funds for the construction of large infrastructure projects could be extremely useful for the economic and social development of these countries and regions, for example?
Well, I do not have any doubts about the principle behind connectivities. I agree. Any kind of investments gone into uh, uh, building potentials as far as connectivities are concerned, those are definitely needed. Connectivity plays an important role in growth. It is not just production, or it is not just about R&D facilities. So connectivities are very important, and BRI talks about connectivities. So let's understand one thing is that I'm not against BRI. I'm not against the connectivities. Okay, as a matter of fact, being an academia, I think connectivity is an important thing, and as being one who has closely seen, how connectivity has been pursued by the Chinese and by the Asian fellow Asians, and as a result of it, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, is in place. Where both India and China are the partners in extending loans to the connectivity projects. So connectivity is definitely essential. Now the problem is the very first part of the question is that is BRI a part of, or can be a part of Chinese economic statecraft? I do not say can be part of. I want to say is the part of Chinese economic statecraft. BRI is not only about investment schemes. BRI is not only about the connectivities. BRI is also an important integral part of China's economic diplomacy, a foreign economic diplomacy. And the foreign economic diplomacy go hand in hand with economic statecraft, because a lot of thought has gone into how the Silk Road economic belt, which traverses over the physical mass of land, and the Maritime Silk Road (MSR), which swims across oceans, has been planned. If you just see the locations of the expansions of this Silk Road and the Maritime Silk Road, you would understand that it is not just a mere coincidence the way it has been planned. Why MSR and SREB, the two manifestations of BRI, are not going through places which do not fall on the side of the Chinese political interest. That is important. It just stops at odd places. It just goes from odd places. So BRI is nothing but a part of China's economic statecraft, and this is non-contested statement. This is not a political statement, but this is well understood and well calibrated based on the empirics. And one would see that BRI was launched to make essential arrangements and essential ecosystems for the Chinese outward development. And this outward development of BRI was supposed to give back to the Chinese economy starting from 2025 onwards and going ahead. So that is how BRI was designed. And BRI is all about, it's a bilateral. BRI is all about, there is no uniform constitution, there is no uniform program or agenda. BRI today between China and Brazil would be different than BRI between China and Spain, China and India, China and Bangladesh. They're different. There is no uniform bracketing, uniform wireframing around BRI. It's a very subjective, it's a very bilateral, very interest-oriented. And when something is interest-oriented, something which is non-uniform globally, are chances of having political vicious interests, which can very well clubbed with economic statecraft.
Thank you, Aravind, and thank you, Mauricio. On that note, I would like to thank Dr. Aravind Yelery for joining us tonight. I say tonight because it's past midnight in India, and I know Aravind could go on and on for hours. We must let him rest because he probably has classes tomorrow. I'd like to thank all of you who join us, especially our Asia experts, both at UFRGS and at ISAP. Aravind, would you like to add anything else to your final remarks?
Well, I want to say that, this is my concluding remarks, but I think there has to be a strong Asia studies orientation, need to be countries like Brazil. My whole intention to engage with my counterparts, colleagues, and friends in Brazil is all about creating strong opinionated pieces, analysis with regard to China and India, because Brazil is an integral part of the world discussion. So as I said, when I was writing about State Grid, and I had to refer to how much State Grid is investing in Brazil. So please don't take it this program as something I want to promote the book, but I want to promote the Asian studies and India-China studies in Brazil. And there are a lot of things need to be done or need to be developed between or maybe beyond what we have discussed today. A last compliment to the organizers, UFRGS and ISAP, for hosting me, giving me an opportunity to talk about the book. I hope we will see you soon, and maybe there are many things which we are going to arrange, collaborate on together. So thank you. With that note, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aravind. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Bettina. Also, special thanks to Nathan Schumann, who helped us set up this event. And we will see you next time, not soon enough. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.